Giacomo Casanova. His love affairs were legendary. He seduced hundreds of women, sometimes with his irresistible charm, but more often merely through the use of money. However, his escapades did not come without consequences. He contracted a sexually transmitted disease 11 times and also fathered a dozen illegitimate children, as documented. Imprisoned for his licentious lifestyle in the notorious lead chambers of Venice, he escaped in a flight so daring that it became a topic of conversation throughout Europe. In his old age, unable to love as passionately as in his youth, Casanova turned to another pleasure, the sensual enjoyment of food. His early life, Giacomo Casanova was born in 1725 in Venice into a family of actors and musicians. His father, Gaetano Casanova, was a dancer and actor, and his mother, Zanetta Ferrucci, was also a famous actress. Casanova's childhood was marked by uncertainty, as his father died early and his mother was often on tour. His earliest memories include frequent nosebleeds and a visit to a sorceress on Murano, who cured him of this ailment. Casanova's education began at a young age when he was raised by his grandmother. He received a comprehensive education and studied law in Padua. He came under the guardianship of Abate Alvise Grimani and developed into a connoisseur of the classics and sciences. He fell in love with Bettina, the sister of his tutor, and began studying law at the University of Padua. Upon his return to Venice, he prepared for a clerical career and received the tonsure. Casanova briefly studied at the Seminario di San Cipriano and became an abbot of the parish priest. He made connections with the Venetian nobility and gained access to higher circles. This decision was partly pragmatic, as the church was one of the few institutions that offered education and professional opportunities at the time. As an abbé, Casanova wore clerical clothing and performed some religious duties, although he was never ordained as a priest. This period as an abbé, however, was only short-lived. Casanova increasingly felt constrained by the restrictions and expectations associated with this role. His penchant for adventure, his interest in worldly pleasures, and his passionate nature were at odds with the duties of a clergyman. For this reason, Casanova briefly entered military service, but he found no fulfillment there either and left the military after just 1 year. Back in Venice, he began to use his diverse talents and charm to move in various social and cultural circles. He worked in various professions, including as a violinist in a theater. During this time, he met Senator Matteo Giovanni Brigadin when he saved his life after a stroke by performing a spontaneous bloodletting. According to today's medical knowledge, it is questionable whether this procedure really saved the senator's life. However, Brigadin saw Casanova as his savior and soon adopted him as his son, committing to support him for life with 10 zecchini per month. This allowed Casanova to lead a materially carefree life for several years. Casanova's seductions. Even in his position as an abbé, Casanova had his first love affairs. Hundreds more were to follow. In Cesena, Casanova experienced one of the deepest infatuations of his life when he met a woman he refers to as Henriette in his memoirs. She was about 4 years younger than he was and stood out to Casanova for her exceptional grace, sharp mind, and wit, qualities he found rare in women. Henriette was in the company of a Hungarian officer, over 60 years old, with whom she was on her way to Parma. Despite his growing affection for Henriette, Casanova treated the officer with great respect, showcasing his ability to navigate complex emotional situations. In Bologna, a crucial turn occurred. Henriette, who referred to her husband and her father-in-law, who wanted to send her to a convent as monsters, chose Casanova and left the officer. The following 3 months were described by Casanova as a frenzy of happiness. He regarded Henriette as the greatest love of his life and even called her his wife. However, their relationship was doomed to fail when Henriette was recognized and forced to return home. Casanova accompanied her on her journey over Mont Cenis and up to Geneva. There, they had to part ways in February 1750, heavy-hearted. It would be 15 years before Casanova and Henriette met again, highlighting the deep and lasting impact of this relationship on Casanova. Donna Lucrezia. Lucrezia was an attractive married woman, and Casanova was immediately drawn to her. Their relationship started quickly and was characterized by strong physical attraction. Casanova met Lucrezia during his travels to Rome. An attraction between Casanova and Lucrezia developed swiftly. Despite the fact that Lucrezia was married, they began a secret affair. This relationship was typical of Casanova's romantic adventures, which often started spontaneously and were marked by their intensity and passion. Lucrezia was in a marriage that did not fulfill all her emotional and possibly physical needs, which was not uncommon at the time. She became pregnant by Casanova. Lucrezia's husband, who apparently knew he was raising Casanova's daughter but accepted it, named her Giacomina. 20 years later, Casanova encountered Leonilda in Naples, the mistress of the Duke, and proposed marriage to her. After the Duke gave his consent, a marriage contract was drawn up. However, Leonilda turned out to be the daughter of Donna Lucrezia, who was by then 38 years old. Leonilda was actually Casanova's daughter. Casanova was shocked, but he consoled himself with the thought that the affair with Leonilda was not a sin, since he did not know she was his daughter. The nuns, MM and CC. In one of the most notorious episodes of his life, Casanova had an affair with two nuns. It started when Casanova fell in love with the 14-year-old Caterina Capretta, known as CC. Her brother Pietro, a Freemason, tried to match the two and exploit Casanova financially. Casanova and Caterina pledged marriage to each other, but her parents locked her in the Santa Maria degli Angeli convent on Murano. Casanova learned of this through a messenger and tried to maintain contact. He repeatedly visited the convent's church to see CC. On one such occasion, on All Saints' Day, 1753, an unknown woman dropped a letter at his feet. She wrote that she had been watching him for 3.5 months and wanted to meet him. This woman, Marina Morosini, referred to as MM in his memoirs, was voluntarily in the convent but still a free spirit. She was also the mistress of the French ambassador, Pierre de Berny. Casanova met Marina in a parlor of the convent for the first time, but initially she did not speak to him, possibly because he had not introduced himself out of caution. Later, Casanova apologized for his behavior, and they began to meet regularly. Soon after, Casanova received a farewell letter from Caterina Capretta, who had learned of the affair through convent gossip. The French ambassador, Pierre de Bernis, Morosini's lover, supported Casanova's relationship with Marina and even secretly observed their first night of love, which took place in his house. Over time, Bernis developed a friendly relationship with Casanova. Meanwhile, Morosini introduced Caterina to the mysteries of Sappho, Casanova's strategies and methods, charm and intelligence. Casanova often used his wit and education to impress and seduce. He was known for his ability to engage in interesting conversations and establish intellectual connections. Psychological understanding. He had a knack for recognizing and addressing the emotional and psychological needs of women, which helped him build deep connections. Adaptability. Casanova tailored his seduction methods to the specific situation and person. He was capable of creating both romantic and adventurous scenarios. Use of money and gifts. In some cases, Casanova used his financial status or offered gifts to gain the affection and attention of women. Manipulation and blackmail. There were also situations where Casanova resorted to less honorable methods, including manipulation and even blackmail, to achieve his goals. Casanova's dark sides. Casanova's life was marked by adventures and excesses, but also by morally questionable decisions and actions. His memoirs and the reports about him portray a man who was in many ways ahead of his time, but also deeply rooted in the problematic social and moral norms of his era. Affairs with minors. Casanova showed interest in young women who, by today's standards, would often be considered minors. His seduction techniques frequently targeted very young women, which is rightly seen as problematic and morally reprehensible today. Gambling and financial instability. Casanova was known for his gambling addiction. He won and lost large fortunes gambling and was involved in numerous scams. His handling of money was often reckless, leading to repeated expulsions from various cities. Sexually transmitted diseases. Casanova contracted sexually transmitted diseases at least 11 times throughout his life. Despite his extensive medical knowledge, which allowed him to treat himself, these infections reflect his reckless lifestyle. Violence and dueling. Casanova often resorted to weapons like swords or pistols and was involved in several duels, some of which ended fatally. He tended to use violence to defend his honor or punish swindlers. Exploitation of power differences. Casanova exploited the experience and power differences between him and women. He left many of his lovers and then tried to match them with other men. His attitude towards women was often manipulative and exploitative. Violence against women. Although Casanova generally condemned violence against women, there were exceptions where he beat women, especially if they refused payment or if he flew into a rage. Ambition and overestimation of self. Casanova often harmed himself through excessive ambition and overestimation of self. He felt too secure, did not avoid conflicts, and let himself be lured into dangerous situations. His imprisonment. On the morning of July 26, 1755, Casanova was arrested for alleged blasphemous verses against the holy religion and taken to the state prison without being informed of the reasons for his arrest. In fact, the Venetian State Inquisition had been aware of him since 1753, accusing him of squandering money, unauthorized dealings with foreigners, and Freemasonry. He was viewed as a man without faith, a corrupter, and a swindler, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison in the lead-covered cells of the Doge's palace. In prison, Casanova suffered under extreme conditions, including heat, rats, fleas, and lack of sleep. He suffered from physical exhaustion and hemorrhoids. Despite his poor health, he gained access to books and magazines, thanks to the efforts of his patron Brigadin. After several months, Casanova began to devise escape plans and worked on a hole under his bed. However, his escape was delayed by the quartering of a fellow prisoner. Eventually, after 15 months, he managed to escape with the help of his fellow prisoner, Marino Balbi. They climbed through holes onto the roof, rappelled down, and escaped through the chancellery. After their escape, they went their separate ways, and Casanova fled to France through various stations. On January 5, 1757, Casanova reached Paris and quickly established connections with influential people with the help of his friend Bernice. He co-founded the first public lottery, which turned out to be a huge success. Casanova received 6% of the revenue and was responsible for the advertising and organization. The first draw brought in total revenue of 2 million francs, of which the government won 600,000. This venture made Casanova a wealthy man, and he would spend the next few years indulging in hedonistic excesses across Europe. Casanova's final years. Casanova's situation in early June 1771 was desperate. He wrote, "All my friends whose purses had been opened to me had died. He still had 600 to 700 thalers, plus watches, snuff boxes, pretty rings of little value. At 46, he felt old and wrote, 'For 8 years my potency had gradually decreased. Everything made me realize that all that was left for me was to make an inevitable decline, whose fixed goal is death, as little unpleasant as possible.' In 1774, he returned to Venice for the first time in 18 years. Here his memoirs break off, but numerous other sources allow for further tracing of his life's path. He worked for a time as a spy for the Venetian State Inquisition, founded a monthly magazine, tried his hand as a theater director, and continued to travel all over Europe. His last years at Castle Dux in Bohemia, where he worked as a librarian, were marked by monotony and disputes with other castle residents. He continued to correspond and travel, but suffered from health problems and boredom. Unable to love as passionately as in his youth, Casanova turned to another joy, the sensual pleasure of food. He began writing his memoirs, working on them until his death on June 4, 1798. Casanova died of a urinary tract condition and was buried in the cemetery of St. Barbara in Dux. The exact location of his grave is unknown today. Only the gravestone remains at the chapel. In his last words, he is said to have stated that he lived like a philosopher and was now dying as a Christian. Casanova's life story provides a detailed insight into the social, cultural, and political life of Europe in the 18th century. His travels through various countries and his interactions with people from different social strata paint a vivid picture of the time. Casanova was a witness to many significant historical events and developments. His accounts offer a personal perspective on history that is often missing in official historical documents. In many cultural adaptations, Casanova is often portrayed as a one-dimensional womanizer, which reduces the complexity of his real personality. The real Casanova was also a complex character with many interests and talents beyond his romantic conquests. Apart from his love affairs, Casanova was a highly educated man who had an interest in literature, philosophy, and science. He was a prolific writer and had connections to many significant personalities of his time. This intellectual side is often overlooked in the myth. While many of his stories are based on true events, it's important to note that memoirs are subjective, and Casanova could be considered an unreliable narrator. His depictions could be distorted by personal vanity, the desire for dramatic effect, or simply the unreliability of memory. Casanova lived a life driven by the desire for pleasure, only to end up confronted with the relentless impermanence and inevitable decay that awaits us all. Was it worth it? Or in the end, all that counts are the stories that we leave behind for posterity, and that ultimately make us immortal protagonists in human history.